honourable guests, directors of the Athens Centre, Mr. Zavos and Mrs. Donnelly, colleagues and students, it is a great honour and joy that I attempt to present to you today a very interesting topic in my view, that of the influence of the myth of Orpheus to the genesis of opera. I wish to thank the director, Mr. Zavos, for his very kind words and invitation, as well as the centre and its people for their hospitality and helpfulness throughout the process of setting up this lecture, and especially Ms. Academia.edu. Two concepts immediately strike us as significant from this short introduction. Those would be the concept of myth and the concept of early opera, which, for the purposes of this lecture, will from now on signify the Baroque era, from the 1600 until the 1800. Let's begin with the concept of the Baroque. I would say that you can see the Baroque all around you. You can see it in the details of a leaf, you can see it in the details of a grasso, you can also see it in the details of an organism. Of course, I'm joking, but when one thinks of the Baroque, one thinks of a highly ornate and very extravagant style, as the examples from nature that we saw. And of course, one also thinks of a style that has been apparent in architecture, in music, and that flourished in Europe from the early 17th century until the 18th century. A phrase from Cicero that, in my view, vividly describes the Baroque is delectare et movere, to delight and to emotionally move, which, apart from being the scope of a successful oratory, through the lens of humanism, became the scope of every successful work of art. Another important concept that will concern us today is the concept of myth, the mythos. So what is myth? Well, you can say that according to one of the many definitions of the word, according to the Liddell Scott dictionary, the word myth signifies a story. It can also mean a tale, it can also mean a congress of people, but for our purposes, we'll only focus on the Latin fabula, which signifies a story, as contrasted with a historically validated event. You can also find the word in Homer, as you see here, from this example from the journeys of Odysseus at the island of Calypso, and you see three uses of the word. And there are several characteristics that appear in every myth. Those are that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that it has characters, and I'm thinking here of the theories of the 19th century Russian critic and folklorist Vladimir Prop, who specifically focused on character analysis. It also has a plot and a setting, and it has its origins in the distant past, in the oral past. Therefore, it is related to the Greek word paradosi, or tradition. And it is also important as a concept because it nurtures the very idea of a society's collective cohesion and collective understanding of its character. If we think of the example of Oedipus, and if we think of the myth of Oedipus, we will see that it far precedes the tragedy of Sophocles, Oedipus. The two tragedies of Sophocles, actually, and the many tragedies that refer to the character of Oedipus. Therefore, the subject of the myth far precedes its rendering by poets and creators, and therefore there are also many versions of the myth, and myths are sort of altered according to every poet and every creator's needs. And that's very important, actually, in the Baroque period. We know about ancient myths through basically the tragedies, through tragic poetry. And there are many similarities between ancient tragedies and early opera. I'll just mention a few, but there are many more. The role of the chorus, Deus ex machina, and so on and so forth. Echo lament, and so on and so forth. And we know that there are 33, we only know 33 works by the three major traditions, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, while scholars have argued that there are at least 283 works that only survive in fragments or fragmented versions, in anthologies like the anthology of Ioannis Toveos from the 6th century. So we only have really fragmentary evidence of ancient tragedy in its whole. Let's now move on to the concept of humanism and to the influence of humanism in the period that we call the Renaissance, which preceded, of course, the Baroque period. Humanism was a 14th century movement that advocated a return to classical Greek and Latin sources. And it was through this return that we were able to get rid of the Middle Ages and to pass on to a period that scholars now call the Renaissance. So as I said before, this period was heavily influenced by classical sources. We'll see that in a moment. Here you see an example of a painting by Mantegna of the Gonzaga family, which was a major family of patrons of the Renaissance period, and they were also the patrons of Monteverdi, one of the first and most crucial composers of opera. Here you see a really beautiful fresco by Botticelli, showing Lorenzo Tornabuoni being led by Athena to the 7 liberal arts, including grammar, dialectics, arithmetic, rhetoric, geometry, astrology, probably astronomy, to be more exact, and music, not astrology. Don't mix that. Don't mix those two words. And of course, on the other side of the fresco, we see Giovanna being led to Lorenzo. This concept of the ideal marriage of two people who totally represent the concept of homo universalis, or the universal man, which was the concept of the Renaissance. And I think that it is avidly portrayed in a letter from Gargantua to Pantagruel, as retold by François Rabelais. So I won't get into that, but basically you also see in that letter the value of the Greek, the Latin, the Hebrew, and not only that, but also understanding the basic elements and concepts of virtue. We will move on to Aphrodite, the birth of Aphrodite, another major work of art. You see that you also find Zephyro right there, and of course the hours. Remember the connection of the word hour with the word oreos, which in Greek means beauty. Here you see Primavera, another beautiful example of Botticelli's art, which is inspired by many themes that are apparent in classical mythology, especially Ovid, the Muses. You see Hermes, you see the hours, you see the Graces, and so on and so forth. You see the Vitruvian Man, which is also representative of the Renaissance concept of homo universalis, whereby the human being is at the center of the universe, and it is through human mind and through human understanding that we can comprehend the world and study beauty, by studying the analogies of the human body. The creation of Adam by God, David, and the School of Athens, a very famous painting at the area where at the Vatican museums. Tintoretto, Veronese, Bernini, the wonderful sculpture of Aeneas leading his father out of the city of Troy, and sort of you also see Ascanius on the side, the empire that was saved, the creation of the Roman Empire through the ashes of Troy. And let's now move on to the concept of the magical and to the Renaissance antecedents of opera. In the early 16th century, several humanistic trends converged which allowed the madrigal to form. First, there was a reawakened interest in the use of Italian as a vernacular language. Poet and literary theorist Pietro Bembo edited an edition of Petrarch, the great 14th century poet, in 1501, and later published his theories on how contemporary poets could attain excellence learning from Petrarch. The second madrigal that we will listen to, Zefiro Torna, is a musically rendered poem of Petrarch by Monteverdi. So what is a madrigal, you may ask? So madrigals were strophic poems that already appeared in the 14th century, which eventually include a musical substance and which show, I think, very clearly the transition from modal polyphony to tonal harmony and monophony. We'll see that the first madrigals were polyphonic, which is a characteristic of the Renaissance, and moving on, they became duets, and they included tonal harmonies. So let's look into one major example. Of course, I did not mention that madrigals are heavily inspired by sources like the transformations of Ovid, the Georgics of Virgil, the Idylls of Theocritus, and they're inspired by what we call the Arcadian concept. And here you see an example of an Arcadian landscape. So let's listen now to our first madrigal, which you have right in front of you. Ecco mormorar l'onde. And I'll mention again that this is a typical example of polyphony. Which is characteristic of the Renaissance. So we had a view of a polyphonic madrigal, and let's have a view now of monophonic madrigal, which is Zefiro Torna. May I just mention, for the purposes of those who are interested, that Torquato Tasso, a very important poet of the Renaissance, was the librettist of the first madrigal that we listened to. The librettist of the second madrigal is, or the poet, I should say, is Petrarch, a really important poet of the Renaissance. And this is about Zephyr returning and bringing spring and a chloris and sort of, you know, the ecstasy of spring as a personification of the ideal of love. And it's a wonderful song, and you see the transition quite clearly from those two examples, from polyphony to dual harmony and homophony. The idea. You see a map of the city-states of Italy during the 15th century. As you notice, they're sort of separated, and they're like city-states like in ancient Greece, Florence, Venice, Milan, and that created, you know, sort of friendly antagonism between them. But that was sort of it was if you like, the creation of the Renaissance sprang from that because you know, you had Daphne by Peri in 1598, and then you had Eurydice by Peri in 1600s in Florence, which was performed at the Palazzo Pitti, and then immediately Monteverdi says, well, no, you know, we're going to have a better opera, and this is going to be for the Duke of Mantua, the Gonzaga family, and we're going to create, as a response to Eurydice, Orfeo, for example, which is a masterpiece. So you do have, you know, this kind of antagonism which leads to masterpieces. Here I provide a definition of the word opera, which signifies an extended dramatic composition in which all parts are sung to instrument accompaniment, and it usually includes arias, choruses, recitatives, and sometimes ballet. And remember that the word opera is a 19th century concept. During the early Baroque period, the word that was used was a descriptive word. It was either favola musicale or drama per musica, and so on and so forth. So they used different phrases to signify the term and not the word opera. As you see, a really important contributor of early opera was the Florentine Camerata, as we see already from the 16th century, which was a group of nobles, humanists, who wanted to revive, basically, the very concept of ancient tragedy. We know from scholars today that there were parts in ancient tragedies that were sung as monodies. Scholars of the Renaissance might not have known that, but they were certainly inspired by Neoplatonic ideas that circulated in scholars like Ficino, which stated that, according to Plato and other philosophers, music consists of speech, rhythm, and last sound, not the contrary. So you see here the primacy of speech in early opera, which I think is really important when one considers Monteverdi and works of the Baroque period. So there were basically three Renaissance antecedents of opera. There was the pastoral drama, the magical, as I mentioned before. Pastoral drama was kind of like a theatrical performance. The most important one was L'Orfeo by Poliziano in 1471. The magical, as I mentioned before, and the intermedio. What is the intermedio? When you have a theatrical performance, even today, you need interludes. You need parts of the performance that are broken up, and where you find poems that are accompanied by music, you find choruses, you find something that works as an interlude between the acts of the theatrical performance. And the most important of those interludes was, of course, La Pellegrina, which included many of the major composers of the Baroque period, like Cavalieri and Peri and Caccini. And also, I should note here that it's really important that we have in the Baroque period an idea that comes from Galilei, Vincenzo Galilei, the father of the famous astronomer Galileo Galilei, that we should focus on a single line of melody that accompanies a text. So we should go to a more homophonic structure rather than polyphony. You see here a really famous composer of the period, Giulio Caccini. We're going to listen to one of his madrigals, Amarillo Bella. Madrigal refers to the love of the author towards Amarillo. Let's move on now to the three basic styles that we find throughout opera. We find the recitative, which in early opera is also called recitar cantando, which is basically a part of the opera that is mostly a story narrated with rhythm. It is not a monody, so it is a speech which is accompanied by music. We have the aria, which is a monody, basically, and the arioso, which is something between a recitative and an aria. So when you have, let me put it simply, when you have performers of an opera reciting a text with the accompaniment of music, that's a recitative. When you have performers singing monodies, that's an aria, and there can also be arioso, which is something in between those two. Let's listen now to the prologue of the first opera that has survived. It's not the first opera that was ever composed. The first opera that was ever composed by Peri was Daphne in 1598, and the first opera that has survived is Eurydice. So let's listen to a small extract from the prologue of Eurydice. Let me just mention that this was performed to mark the wedding of Marie de Medici and Henry IV. A wedding celebration which took place in 1600. So why Orpheus, and why, the figure of Orpheus? I think it is noteworthy that Orpheus was born at Livithra, an area in modern Thrace. His parents were Ievros, a mythical river, and the muse of heroic poetry, Calliope, and of course Orpheus, is a mythological character, but according to sources, he lived 11 generations before the Trojan War. So if we think that the Trojan War happened around 1200 BCE, he must have lived around 1400 BCE. Some of the most important sources that we have from antiquity is a poem that describes Orpheus' descent to the underworld of an unknown author, but we also find references to Orpheus in many other ancient sources like Euripides in his Alceste, Hippolytus, Erissos, also in the Agamemnon of Aeschylus, and in other sources.